Hi, my name is Gerald Higa, and welcome to another episode of MiliMoe Sci-Fi. Today I'm going to talk about Isekai. And Isekai, the definition of Isekai is another world, and it's kind of a genre that's in anime and light novels that's pretty popular right now. It's also kind of derided by the American fan community, and I feel like some of that's a bit misplaced, which is why I named this episode in defense of Isekai. And what I suggest is that a lot of the themes and the thematic nature of Isekai is actually elsewhere in science fiction, and that maybe that I often see reviewers say, well, yes, it's another isekai, but this one's good because. And I think that if you have to qualify yourself like that, obviously that means that maybe attacking isekai as a genre is a problem. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't very derivative works that are called isekai, and I get it, and that part I have no problem with calling that out. But I think that just saying inherently because it's isekai somehow it's bad, I think that's a mistake. What started all of this is actually there's an American science fiction series that I really like, and it's a military science fiction series, and that's basically let me bring up the slide here. Uh, the Lost Fleet series by Jack Campbell, which is actually a pen name. He's actually was in the Navy and he wrote a bunch of these books, but it's called The Lost Fleet, and the first book in the series is Dauntless. It's basically a series, I think, of 12 books, and I don't want to give too much away, but the basic premise here is that basically someone from the past is projected into the future because of suspended animation and a rescue pod, and he's basically rescued, and he's revived. And his knowledge of the past empowers him basically to become a very, very powerful and influential commander in the future. So I think, I guess what I'm getting at here is that although this isn't technically another world or anything like that, this whole idea of carrying the knowledge of a mundane world into another world and that it somehow empowers you is actually not just limited to this recent crop of isekai. And I would actually argue that oftentimes, while there are isekai that basically takes a very average person and makes them somehow gives them a power or something like that that empowers them, a lot of times, or at least the ones that I like, the isekai, is that where they're bringing knowledge from one world to another world, and that's what empowers them. Now, these people may actually still be quite exceptional people, but it's that they're in maybe a less exceptional position. Like for instance, there's one who the woman is a bookworm, and but because she knows a lot and she's well read, that gives her a lot of abilities. I have another one where basically the guy studied a lot of history and political science, and that makes him a very very effective administrator. So because of that, I think that actually the isekai genre has a lot of interesting stories to tell. Um, and if we think about what I was talking about, sort of this idea of carrying forward somebody that has knowledge, and that knowledge being empowering, you can think of Armageddon 2419 AD. Now, it's not known as this, it's actually typically known as Buck Rogers or the Buck Rogers universe. And it's the same idea. Now, Buck Rogers, again, was an exceptional person that was brought into the future, but his knowledge and abilities from the past kind of gave him an advantage. And then when he was reawoken in this future self, that he was even further empowered, or he was put in a position where his exceptional skills could be best utilized. And in that sense, I feel like these isekai novels play on that same theme. I mean, what is the appeal of isekai? Is that the idea that this is normally what we would consider from a reader's point of view a somewhat uh, normal person that may have a normal job, like in the case of some of these other books, they might just be an accountant or a bookworm or something like that. But or in another series, he was basically a axeman, a corporate axeman. So he was very logical and an efficiency expert. And see, now you think about this as these are not what we would call epic or sort of heroic characters in a very traditional literary sense, but they're now put in a context where these abilities are actually make them outstanding and make them able to take on this hero's role. And I actually think that's not an uncommon thing. And you know, there's another genre that comes to mind in science fiction that kind of reinforces the idea of this sort of the isekai theme, and that's alternative history. For example, the Harry Turtledove, of course, I think he's better known for his World War series, where the aliens land during World War II. One of his earlier book, and because that's sort of exceptional, and that there's certainly no characters that are moving back and forth there. But in Guns of the South, which is a book that came out before that series really came out, he basically talked about um, people from our time, slightly in the future, capturing a time machine and sending people and weapons back in time to the American Civil War. Now, this is not focusing on a single character, and that single character isn't necessarily the evolution or doesn't necessarily play a hero's role, but it shows the effect of future knowledge in the past, which is a flip side of showing the effect of past knowledge in the future. But the same idea here now, where we're taking what is commonplace, in this case the firearm, for the 20th and 21st centuries, especially modern assault automatic weapons, which is definitely, you know, second half of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century, and then projecting that technology backwards in time would have an amazing, and it would have a really significant effect on the outcome of history. And if we think about it going even further than that, and this kind of hits home for me too, is the idea of war games. And what do war games ask us to do? What a lot of war games do is that they put us in the position of being sort of the hero. We have all the knowledge that we have from our world, and now we are in the command of, let's say, military units, particularly war games. I think. I think that one can argue for RPGs and everything else the same as there, but then that's kind of a crafted narrative. But like very early on in computer gaming, even like I'm talking about like. When the first PCs came out, back in Apple II days and everything else, a lot of what were some of the cutting edge games, or were war games, for instance, were games that used to only be played on the table and sort of unfolded over a long period of time, could now be put on the computer. And what that actually introduced was this whole empowerment, this idea that if I if I were thrown into the World War II situation, how would I take command of these forces? And that's a popular genre. I mean, some of the early games from Strategic Simulations Incorporated (SSI), they basically put you as the commander in. Sometimes they were future battles, so then that's kind of just like speculation on what you would. But a lot of times they're in historical battles, and the interesting thing about historical battles, I would argue, is your role there is to change history. How could I have, for instance, let's say that you play a game like Panzer General. How could I have commanded the Germans differently? Could I have won these battles that Germany ultimately lost? Or, on the flip side, it's like, could I play as the Japanese, and could I somehow change history or do things differently? And I think that that's inherent in a lot of wargaming, and I think that that shows the same idea of this desire to put a person into a situation and give and empower them with the knowledge that they have to somehow change or alter sort of the flow of time, and that makes them a heroic character. So ultimately, I just wanted to say that I do agree with a lot of when there's a lot of people talking about the isekai genre, that yes, there's a lot of derivative work out there, and it's a little bit disheartening because when you see the same theme for the 10th or 11th time, it can seem like, well, I don't want to watch anything that looks like that anymore. But the reality is there are quite a few gems in there that actually, because the genre has been established, and there's sort of, everyone says, oh well, that's it's very tropey and there's all these tropes. But the interesting thing is, a lot of the good authors know that, and the reason why they make it an isekai is because then they can actually riff on it, and they can take variations of it, they can play on that theme and move beyond what the traditional expectations are. I think the first sort of wave of these stories was, oh, a normal person is now thrown into this fantasy world or a computer game world or whatever, and they now are powerful, and because they have that, because they are powerful, they become a hero, and that was good, and that was interesting, and I think for a lot of people, it allowed themselves to kind of see themselves as these characters. Whereas if you know, like in a lot of science fiction, sometimes these characters are pretty unapproachable. You know, if you have the brilliant scientist or you have the amazing a military hero or something like that, it's very difficult to put yourself in their shoes. You might be interested in reading their story, and it might be fascinating to find their human side, but it's difficult to imagine yourself kind of associated with this. But then in these kind of novels, the person themselves is a pretty approachable person. In fact, their description of their mundane lives or their pre entering this alternate world, isekai world, selves might actually be very recognizable. You might say, "Oh, that's me. I recognize that person," right? And by thrusting them into this new world, all of a sudden, whatever skills they have, you may be an exceptional person, but you're stuck in a mundane world. So why not put you in a heroic world where now even your most mundane of skills can make you a hero? And I'll tell you that there's been a lot of interesting novels that I've read. I mean, and they've run the gamut. One was basically a guy who was really good at cooking, and he brought pizza to an otherwise a world dominated by vegan elves. I mean, okay, that was a single book. That was probably just a one-trick pony. But there are a lot of other series that I really enjoy that, and either from novel or anime, where they're dealing with people who have pretty exceptional skills in their own world. Like maybe they're a great coder, or maybe they're very, very good at politics and administration, or maybe they're really, really good at some other task that you would never imagine as the hero of a character. And now they're a hero in this other world. There's a lot of anime about, for instance, like how the food of our world brought to another world is somehow magical, right? And that's not actually that far from either science fiction or video games or anything else. And so I think the genre itself may not be to blame. There may be individual stories within the genre that are far too derivative. They're just like every other story. But I think the actual theme of this, of a person being stuck into another world, is not so far off. And in fact, I think that that is one way to create a character that is associative, and something where now I can associate with the main character here. It's not a main character that's so difficult to understand that I don't feel any attachment to them. And I think that is one of the advantages of isekai. So hopefully, I'm there's no way anything I say is going to somehow suddenly change everyone's opinion, saying, "Oh, yet another isekai." And yet, you find that people will constantly say, "Yet another isekai." They go, "But this one was really cool because." And so I just want everyone to think about why that's the case. And I think that the argument to be made is it's not isekai as a genre, it's that there are a lot of isekai out there. It's very, very popular, and there are better and worse writers and better or worse implementations to that theme. But the theme itself is probably not the problem. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this segment. If you want to hear or see me talk about any other subject, it's interesting because actually when I started this, I was actually going to start just focusing on alternative history, and then it got me thinking about isekai because I just read another book, and it's all of a sudden got me thinking again about maybe some other topics to talk about. So I went off on a tangent. I definitely want to talk about, some of the other topics that I've been throwing around talking about are things like alternative history. I actually want to spend the time just talking about the difficulties of planetary assaults. I think there's a lot of science fiction movies out there, current ones and very popular franchises, I guess, that obsess on some of the concepts of a planetary assault, and yet when you think about how they're portrayed, it doesn't quite make sense. So I wanted to kind of go into that, and not to say that even in my even in the things that I write are necessarily super accurate or super plausible, but I think it would be interesting to spend some time to think about some of those topics. So anyway, hopefully we'll be covering one of those topics in upcoming episodes. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you later.